Hello, and welcome to a short introduction to rhetoric, which will cover the history, use, and practice. Nearly everyone has heard the word rhetoric and likely formed some connotations about the word, but few understand the full implications of rhetoric as an area of study or the focus of everyday practice. For centuries, rhetoric was the central part of the Western education. All educated people learned and practiced rhetoric, and it was often what students worked up to in their educational process. In some settings, this has continued to be the case, but for most of us, we do not have the opportunity to learn about rhetoric or to take a class in it until we come to college, and perhaps not even then. There are many definitions of rhetoric, but probably the most common or influential one comes from Aristotle, whose brief definition of rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Of course, this is a highly condensed version of his definition, as his work Rhetoric from around 350 BC is comprised of 3 books, all of which go into great detail describing multiple types of arguments, appeals, audience responses, situations, and speakers. While Aristotle's works come from his students' notes on his lectures, Rhetoric by Aristotle is still considered one of the most important foundational works for the study, analysis, and practice of rhetoric and remains valid even today. Another famous rhetorician whose work remains influential is Cicero, a lawyer and statesman from the last days of the Roman Republic. He had very strong ideas about the ideal orator, whom he thought should be virtuous, educated, and able to speak on nearly any topic of importance. Cicero wrote and spoke extensively when he was alive, and is considered the last strong defender of the Roman Republic, which fell into a dictatorship near the time of his death. His outspoken rhetoric about defending the Republic was one of the main factors responsible for his execution. A third figure from the ancient past whose work was highly influential throughout Western history and education is Quintilian. In his definition, rhetoric is also an art that implies ethics and virtue, and in this view, one could not be a true orator if one did not have strong character and virtue. Quintilian was an influential teacher of oratory after Cicero, around the 1st century AD, and was the first to give what still reads as surprisingly modern views of education through encouragement and support, rather than through punishment and fear, which was the norm at the time. These 3 figures in particular formed the basis of the Jesuit rhetorical tradition, known as eloquentia perfecta, which is based in the idea that rhetoric should be used in service of the greater good. You can see in this definition how ethics underpins the Jesuit rhetorical tradition and is incorporated into the use, teaching, and practice of rhetoric. This ethical component is an aspect to keep in mind as you both analyze and use rhetoric in your daily lives. When persuasion is at play, it is always a good idea to pause and ask, who is served by this idea or message? What are the means the rhetor uses to get their idea across? Are these means ethical? There are no easy answers to these questions and much debate that can arise around them, but keep these ideas in mind whenever you encounter or use rhetoric. Of course, all of this talk of ancient history may lead you to wonder, why is this important now? The answer is because rhetoric is all around us, every day. In every advertisement, political speech, discussion of policy or rules, or argument about who is going to wash the dishes next Tuesday, you'll find rhetoric and rhetorical appeals underlying each argument. If rhetoric is the study of persuasion, how does persuasion work? According to our friend Aristotle, there are 3 basic appeals. These appeals are ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is based in the character, ethics, or authority of the speaker or writer. This is how a speaker establishes credibility with his or her audience, which can be based in experience, position, knowledge, expertise, goodwill, or trustworthiness. However, this perception of ethos can change with the audience. Not every audience considers every speaker trustworthy or an expert. The next appeal is logos, which is based in logic, reason, and rationality. It can be presented in the form of verbal logic, but may also be expressed in charts, graphs, statistics, facts, etc. Logos was Aristotle's favorite appeal, and in his perfect world, rationality would be all that we need. However, since that is not the case, beware of logical fallacies, or things that sound logical but really are not. Pathos, which are appeals that call upon emotions and values, can make the audience feel emotions such as pity, anger, fear, excitement, inspiration, etc. This can occur at the subconscious level and may not be readily apparent to the audience member. For instance, when someone says that they aren't sure why they agree with a certain argument or person, but they, quote, feel it in their gut, they may be responding to a pathos appeal that resonates strongly with them. Although Aristotle gave pathos a bad rap and wished that everyone could be moved only by logic, the reality is that it is pathos that moves people to action. The emotions we feel are based in our deepest values. Thus, it is at this level where people can be persuaded to actually do something about what they see happening in the world. A well-formed argument will typically combine elements of all three appeals, leading to logically formed claims backed by clear evidence presented by a rhetor with a high level of ethos based in goodwill and expertise that taps into emotions or deeply held values held by the addressed audience. If you think about it, you can probably see how an argument would be less effective if any of these components is missing. For instance, even if a speaker has great influence on a particular audience and their emotions are aroused, if that person's argument is not based in sound logic and evidence, it is not a good argument, and those who figure out that the claims are based in faulty logic are likely to disregard the speaker's aims. You may note that, in reality, not every argument contains all three of these elements. For example, if we look at this ad from the 1950s, we can see how a popular cigarette manufacturer used strong ethos appeals, along with pathos, to influence consumers to buy their product. The most apparent appeal here is the ethos of apparent medical approval from doctors, which is referenced in both text and image. This implies that the medical profession approves of smoking, and that it especially approves of this brand. It should be noted that later it came out that this survey cited in this ad was conducted immediately after the manufacturer gave out free samples of its product, but consumers didn't know this at the time that the ads ran. Furthermore, anytime there is an image of another person, there is some force of pathos at play. Viewers are supposed to feel a sense of identification with and admiration for the person in the ad, who is posed to look like a doctor, someone with cultural influence, a good job, and general respect. Also, if a person is already addicted to smoking, seeing another person enjoying a cigarette might also trigger feelings of craving and desire. These emotions, combined with the ethos of apparent medical approval for these cigarettes, is designed to persuade consumers that they want to be like the doctor in the picture. And though it is unlikely that this will lead them toward applying to medical school, they can borrow some of his cultural power and ethos by smoking the same cigarettes. If we pan down to the text underneath the image, we see more evidence of ethos and pathos appeals. For example, the ad invokes the medical profession at large more directly here, connecting it explicitly to their product. The doctor's enjoyment of the product is then linked to the consumer's enjoyment of the product. Additional emotion words are used to describe the product as well, invoking the cool mildness of the cigarettes, as well as the flavor. There is even a call to action in this text, challenging consumers to try this brand for 30 days, which if nothing else would increase sales during that time and might potentially lead to new brand loyalty. The final line in this segment leaves the viewer with a succinct, catchy phrase that connects the ethos of the doctors to a patriotic idea, invoking identification with the audience as well as bandwagon appeal. The bottom of the ad invokes more ethos and pathos, showing other respectable Americans giving testimonials for the superiority of this product, creating more identification and ethos for the brand. Also included is an image of the product itself, the object that consumers should look for on the shelf and select the next time, or perhaps the first time, they purchase cigarettes. Analyzing this visual argument for the types of appeals used, you may notice something. Where is the logos? At what point does the ad bring up hard facts, evidence, or sound backing for their claims? The answer is they don't, not really. They do reference the survey that was given to doctors about the brand that they smoke, but, as already noted, that survey was conducted by the manufacturer itself, not an independent agency, and included free samples of the product immediately beforehand, which makes the claims based upon that evidence dubious at best. Additionally, this also makes an assumption that doctors smoke, and while certainly some, perhaps even many, did at the time, this ad makes no direct claims to the healthfulness of smoking, though by the way the text is phrased and positioned, it is implied that smoking must not carry health risks, otherwise, why would doctors smoke? This leads to two other ideas to consider when confronting any rhetorical text: logical fallacies and a concept called kairos. Logical fallacies are presentations of ideas that appear logical at first glance, but which are not upon closer examination. For instance, the invocation of the medical profession in the cigarette ad, even showing a person who appears to be a doctor, is an example of a logical fallacy called appeal to false authority, since no doctors in this ad actually say smoking is good for your health, but it is all the while implied. There are also examples of bandwagon appeal, which is a logic fallacy that can basically be summarized as everyone else is doing it, so you should too. This fallacy is designed to trigger the human social response to be like one's peers, but it is not in any way logical. The second thing to remember when viewing this or any rhetorical text is the idea of kairos. Kairos is related to the time at which a text arises and how that timing influences the argumentative potential of a text. For instance, this ad appeared in the 1950s when cultural attitudes and scientific knowledge about smoking were significantly different than they are today. This ad literally could not appear today because of regulations banning advertising cigarettes, but if it did, its reception would be very different than at the time it was published several decades ago. Kairos is also important to the potential influence of a text that it is sometimes considered a fourth appeal. So whenever you examine an artifact rhetorically, always keep in mind the time at which the text first appeared, what it was responding to, and the potential historic and cultural differences that might have been present in that context. Additionally, it may be easier to spot logic fallacies and other misleading forms of rhetorical influence in texts that are more different from our current cultural moment. The closer a rhetorical object is to our time, place, and way of thinking, the more difficult it can be to analyze objectively. Thus, it is always a good idea to beware of arguments with which you immediately, almost automatically, agree. Just because you find an argument appealing or persuasive doesn't mean that it is sound, logical, or even true. It is also imperative to note the context, occasion, or purpose of an argument. This is important because various discourse communities value certain appeals over others and count different types of evidence as valid backing for claims. For instance, in most scientific writing, and scholarly writing in general, there is much more emphasis placed on logos and ethos than on pathos. In this example of a scholarly article, the names, disciplines, and institutions of the authors are listed up front so that readers know who did the writing and research and can easily ascertain their credentials to speak upon these topics. Unlike our cigarette ad, these authors are ostensibly actual authorities on this topic, and while some people in their field might argue with how much or how little expertise any individual may have, generally speaking, these authors are likely to be experts in the fields in which they research. Additionally, there is a clear logic to the layout of ideas, methods, results, and conclusions given up front in this article. Every claim is backed by specific facts, with the promise that these claims will be explored in even more detail later in the article. Make no mistake about it, though, this is still an argument, not just a listing of facts. While it was very easy to see the rhetorical appeals in a cigarette ad from many decades ago, it can be more challenging to find and analyze rhetorical appeals in texts that are close to us, especially ones that rely upon logos, ethos, and an authoritative tone. However, any time a claim is made and conclusions are drawn, there is an argument at play, though in academic circles much more emphasis is placed on using qualifiers, basing conclusions on factual, measurable evidence, and not overstating the scope of an argument. Because academic articles are peer-reviewed and likely to be challenged or built upon by other researchers, writers tend to be more careful about how they construct arguments in these contexts than you might find in writing geared toward the general public. Still, if we were to look at a scientific or scholarly article from many decades ago, it would likewise be much easier to spot the assumptions, subtle emotional appeals, and logical fallacies in those arguments. As before, the closer we get to our own conventions, ideologies, and daily practices, the harder it becomes to see through the rhetorical appeals and influences that may be at work. So, what should we take away from this exploration of rhetoric historically, theoretically, and analytically? First, the history of rhetoric is important, partially because the same appeals that worked on ancient Greek audiences and were written about at that time still influence people today. Also, rhetoric used to be central to Western education. Every educated person throughout most of Western history had training in rhetoric, up until a little over 100 years ago. While training in rhetoric is making a comeback and has always been available in some disciplines, such as public speaking, communications, and advertising, it is important for everyone today to understand the ways that persuasive arguments affect their daily lives and decisions. Second, the main appeals that seem to affect audiences the most are ethos, pathos, and logos, though kairos, or the timing of an argument, is also important to the effectiveness of that argument and may influence how that text is analyzed or viewed at a later date. Third, different situations, occasions, and purposes rely on different uses of rhetorical appeals in their arguments. Specific discourse communities and audiences may privilege rhetorical appeals differently, so that an approach that might be effective in one context, such as an editorial in a local paper or in a magazine ad, may not work in a different context, such as a scientific journal. Understanding the context for a rhetorical artifact will help you analyze how that artifact operated in its original setting for its intended audience, which can greatly influence the way a text is rhetorically constructed. Fourth, the use of rhetoric always has an ethical component that should be considered when examining any text. While some rhetorical theorists would disagree with this point, claiming that rhetoric and ethics have nothing to do with each other, others, such as Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, and a host of thinkers who follow in that tradition, would argue that any time rhetoric is utilized, it affects the system of power in which it is invoked. Therefore, we should critically analyze who is trying to influence whom, to what purpose, and to whose benefit. This is why the Jesuit tradition of eloquentia perfecta focuses on, quote, speaking well for the greater good, end quote, as a way of grounding the use of rhetoric in a foundation of ethical considerations. However, as we saw from our cigarette ad, this is not the use of rhetoric deployed by all. In fact, many would argue that ethics are often ignored in the pursuit of influence in winning an argument, which is all the more reason to consider the ethical implications of how, why, and when rhetoric is used. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions about this video or the study of rhetoric in general, please feel free to get in touch with me or drop by my office hours.